thank you all so much for joining us. I want to introduce tonight's moderator, Tina de Bellegarde. Tina's debut novel, Winter Witness, the first in the Batavia on Hudson mystery series, was nominated for an Agatha Award for Best First Novel, among several other awards. Reviewers have dubbed Tina the Louise Penny of the Catskills. Dead Man's Leap, which was her second book, was recently released in April. Hopefully I'm getting all this right, Tina. Tina's Storio, Tokyo Stranger, appears in the Mystery Writers of America anthology, When a Stranger Comes to Town. Her short stories also appear in the Best New England Crime Stories. And Tina also writes award flash fiction, which you can read on her website. She is, or recently was, the vice president of the Upper Hudson chapter of Sisters in Crime, and she is also a member of the Mystery Writers of America and Writers in Kyoto. Tina lives in Catskill, New York, with her husband, Dennis, and their cat, Shelby, where they tend to their beehives, harvest shiitake mushrooms, and cultivate their vegetable garden. And Tina travels to Japan regularly to visit her son, Alessandro. And I guess I should have mentioned that tonight's program is entitled Amateur Sleuths in the World of Art and Artifacts. It's a panel of mystery writers. Every work of art has a story, and some of them are deadly. Travel the globe with 5 mystery authors and their amateur sleuths as they delve into the world of art and artifacts. So everyone, let's give a big virtual round of applause to our panel. And Tina, you can kick it off and take it away. Thanks so much.
Oh, thank you, Robert. What a great introduction. My goodness. I didn't realize you had such a biography for me, so I'm very grateful. Thank you. But I'm grateful to Robert, to Tewksbury Library for hosting us. Thank you to all the extra libraries, those 15 libraries in the system or outside the system who are helping promote us, who are giving us some play tonight. I'm very excited. We're really happy to be here. And the 5 of us have gotten together to tour our books because we've discovered that we share this fascination with art and artifacts and crime. And, you know, we decided that it would make a great panel, and we've been working together now for a while, and we have tons of all the stories are very different. So I think you're going to enjoy this. And like Robert said, we like to remind our readers that every work of art has a story, and some of them are deadly. Again, I'm going to remind you, I think Robert mentioned it. If you have questions, just add them into the chat or the Q&A function. We'll be checking later at the end of the program for questions. And I think I'm going to get started. All right. I'm going to start with an introduction to M.A. Manin. All right. So Mary's over there with that pretty background. Mary Manin's debut novel, Death in the Aegean, came out this spring from Level Best Books. Her short stories have appeared in the Anthony Award-winning anthology Mystery Most Edible, also in Black Cat Mystery Magazine and Black Cat Weekly. An avocational archaeologist and Air Force veteran, Mary divides her time between writing, traveling, and hiking. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about her book, Death in the Aegean. When a former archaeology student, Stephanie Adams, travels to Greece, she's suspected of murdering a wealthy bride who accused her deceased father of artifact theft. So, Mary, your book's character blends archaeology, romance, and a museum heist, right, of a precious artifact. Why don't you tell us a little bit about how you came about to write it? What was, your backstory?
So Death in the Aegean takes place on the Greek islands of Santorini and Crete. I've always been fascinated in archaeology. So when my husband and I went to Santorini, we made a point to visit the archaeological site of Akrotiri, which was a Minoan town buried in the ash from the eruption on Santorini in about 1628 BC. And it was very fascinating. And a lot of the buildings and streets have been excavated, and they found a lot of household items, like a lot of pots of different types and loom weights, which is interesting. But to date, they've only found a single gold statue, and that's of a small ibex, a type of goat. But on nearby Crete, which was also a center of Minoan culture, from the same time period, there have been snake goddess statues found, but they've been made of ceramic, faience, a type of ceramic. And so my mind went to what if a gold snake goddess statue was found at Akrotiri? What kind of people would come see it? And how would they interact with each other? And human nature being what it is, of course, someone would covet it. And Stephanie learns this the hard way, as when the Akrotiri snake goddess is stolen from the Führer Museum, she becomes tangled in a web of international intrigue, theft, and murder. And as the handsome German tourist Thomas says, where greed leads, murder follows. So that's a little bit about my story. I'd like to tell you a little bit about Connie Berry. Now, Connie Berry is an award-winning and best-selling author who writes the Kate Hamilton mystery series set in the UK and featuring an American antiques dealer with a gift for solving crimes. Connie was raised by antiques dealers who instilled in her a passion for history, art, and foreign travel. She lives in Ohio with her husband and adorable dog, Emmy. Connie's latest book is The Shadow of Memory. As Kate Hamilton contemplates her future with Detective Inspector Tom Mallory, she's also helping her colleague Eva Tweedy organize an upcoming auction at a seaside village on the Suffolk coast. Netherfield Sanatorium, an abandoned Victorian insane asylum, is being converted into luxury townhouses. But when retired criminal inspector Will Parker is found dead, Kate discovers that the halls of the sanatorium housed much more than priceless art. So Connie, this is the fourth Kate Hamilton book. She's the one with the artistic sensitivities and the knack of finding herself in the middle of murder. Why did you choose an antiques dealer for your protagonist?
Well, first of all, thank you to Robert and the Tewksbury system and all of those who are here tonight. It's so much fun to talk about this. And the reason that I chose an antiques dealer was because that is the world that I know. That is the world that I grew up in. My parents were high-end antiques dealers. This was an avocation for them that became a little side business. My father was an engineer and an inventor, but he grew up on the Rockefeller summer home estate in Lakewood, New Jersey. He was raised by his Scottish grandparents. And so he had, because they were caretakers, he had access to this big mansion. And the Rockefellers weren't there all that much. They were there in the summer. So he roamed around this big house, and they had a room that was dedicated to Chinese art and antiquities. And as a small boy, my father became fascinated with Asian art, and he never lost that, and he passed that along to me. So this is the world that I knew, the world that I grew up in. My mother was a researcher. She loved to look into the history of objects and to determine as much information as she possibly could about the objects and who had owned them and what their history was. And so I just came into this naturally. I love thinking about history and the past and how it impacts today. And I now am going to introduce to you Nina Waxman. Nina is, she runs a digital marketing company, and she studied illustration with Maurice Sendak, if you can believe it, at the Parsons School of Design. She has a passion for the magical city of Venice, where her novel of historical suspense, The Gallery of Beauties, is set. It's just been published by Level Best Books. And I think, if I'm not wrong, Nina, you can tell us maybe later. I think that your family history goes back to Venice as well. Yeah. So I want to tell you a little bit about the Gallery of Beauties. It's Venice, 1612, a golden age for women of talent, beauty, and ambition. Two very different women, a notorious courtesan and a rabbi's daughter, are brought together by an artist who chooses them as subjects for a gallery of beauties, portraits of the most beautiful women of Venice. And so my question, Nina, for you is, what is it about the artist and the portrait that motivated your heroine to leave the ghetto, which would have been a dangerous thing to do, and also something that a woman in her position would never ordinarily do?
Yes, thanks, Connie, for the introduction. So I am very drawn to Venice. I'm obsessed with Venice, you could say, and my family does come from Venice. And what's interesting is my family is also a rabbinic family. So my ancestor was the chief rabbi of Venice at the time that my novel takes place. And I am a descendant of lots of rabbis, so I know the conflicts and I know what goes on in those closed communities. The ghetto of Venice was the first ghetto ever. So it was the first ghetto ever created, and that's where we got the term, was from Venice. And it was created for Jews at that time as a protective place. So it was walled, and Jews were put in there as a way to keep them protected, because everybody went to Venice originally because of the attacking Visigoths and Huns who came through, and Venice was all island. So it was a little bit protective for everybody there. So the ghetto of Venice itself is an island, and they had gates that I said were we locked up. But there were some rules and regulations about Jews leaving the ghetto. They weren't allowed to leave the ghetto at night, and one thing. And so leaving the ghetto, they would close the gates. And if you wanted to leave, if you were found outside the gates, at certain points in time, you could be fined or you could be imprisoned. So it was very dangerous. But on the other hand, that time period in Venice was very unusual for women. So women had a lot more freedom than they usually had. So there were women glass blowers, there were women artists. At the time, there was also a woman prodigy who happened to have been the first woman ever to have received a PhD from a university. So there was a little bit flexibility with women doing things. So as a woman, she had intellectual curiosity, and she was already a scholar. Her father had let her study, her husband, and she's a Talmudic scholar. But the one thing she couldn't find anything out about in the ghetto was about art, because there were no Jews who were artists. There were Jews who were scribes, but they were not artists, because Jews weren't allowed to join guilds where they could become artists and become apprentices to artists. They weren't allowed to join the academy to learn art. So it was a huge mystery to her. And then a woman for an intellectual curiosity was dying to find out more about it. And that intellectual curiosity, as well as being confined both physically and mentally almost to this area, that's a walled-in area, just made her have, this was an opportunity she was presented to go out of this, and how could she possibly pass that up? So it overcame all those fears of the fines and going out at night and things like that, because of that short opening to opportunity to get out of the ghetto. So that's a little bit about me. And now I get to introduce the lady at the end with the beautiful picture of the Louvre in behind her. And the reason she has a picture for Louvre is that she's the author of a new book called The Collector. And she's a baby boomer, in case you can't tell. And she's also writes another series under another name. She's very versatile. Cordy Abbott is her other name. And she writes the Old Town Antique Mystery series. And Dead Men Don't Decorate is her first in that series, which is coming out in November of 22. She lives in Alexandria, Virginia, and also in Lewes, Delaware. And her book, The Collector, which the reason why you see that background behind her, is the first installment in Lane's art thriller trilogy called The Big Picture. And in this book, her main character, Emma Kelly, to her, life looks like a masterpiece, but she's keeping a very big secret. She has 2 husbands. So that's the kicker in her series. And so the interesting thing about Lane is her book has been described as Dan Brown meets a female James Bond in the art world. So whatever Lane Stone, who lives in Delaware and in Massachusetts, tell us how you could possibly think of a woman who has husbands in 2 locations.
I don't know how I thought of that. It just kind of came to me one day when I was writing this, but I've written several traditional mystery series where you have the amateur sleuth and you have the violence taking place off stage and you have it in a small town usually. I've written several of those, and my other series is a traditional mystery. So I will behave again then. But I was just in the mood to write like the most outrageous heroine I could think of. And I wanted to see if people would still like her, even though she has made a life choice most of us wouldn't make. And I failed to thank Robert, but Robert, thanks so much for hosting us. I am going to talk about Tina de Bellegarde, and Robert introduced her in the beginning, but I've read her books, and so I can add on to that. He said that she's been called the Louise Penny of the Catskills. Well, that's because she's a great writer and she lives in the Catskills. As he said, with her husband and their cat, they tend bees and they harvest shiitake mushrooms. Her books are the Batavia on Hudson Mysteries, or award-winning series. The last book out was Dead Man's Leap. When a storm forces the villagers of Batavia on Hudson to seek shelter, the river rises and so do tempers. The flood washes up a corpse and a priceless Japanese artifact. And Bianca St. Denis, I love that name, finds herself teaming up with the sheriff once again to solve the murder. Tina, in general, the series isn't set around artifacts. And how did you choose this artifact, and why did you decide to incorporate it into Dead Man's Leap?
Well, Lane, thank you. Yeah, it's true. I don't usually write, as your books tend to be around the artifacts and the art dealers. You know, my books are traditional mysteries. Some people call them cozies, and they take place in the Hudson Valley. So this is kind of new, but I decided to insert an artifact because this particular book is centers around Leonard Marshall, who's a former antiques dealer. And he used to work in an important auction house, but he left that to try to reinvent his life in this quiet little town in Batavia on Hudson. And he left that all behind because there was something shady in his background, and he was hoping to, to start fresh. And in fact, there are a lot of characters in this book who are keeping secrets and trying to move beyond them. But as far as what artifact I was going to choose, it could have been anything because Leonard Marshall has this background in antiques, but I decided to make it a Japanese artifact, and it's a carved netsuke. And netsuke's are usually made of wood or ivory. This one is made after the image of Ebisu. He's one of the gods of good fortune. He carries a large carp and a fishing rod, and he's the protector of fishermen, which also ties into my story because there is a fishing tournament and there's a storm and a flooding, so kind of goes in there. But netsukes are decorative, and they're also useful. And they have, I have one here. I don't know, can you see it? It's so hard with these virtual backgrounds there. It's a turtle. This is one netsuke, and they have these holes in the back, and there they are. And those are used, and that's why they're useful. They're used to tie the obi sash around the Japanese traditional kimono for a man, and they're used. They tie through those holes, and then they either and then they're used as a counterweight to things that they need to dangle on their obi sash. So it could be decorative, it could be useful, like a tobacco pouch or something like that. Anyway, I decided to choose Japanese, so I thought it could connect to my series better, right? My main character has a son who lives in Japan, like I do. And there's another character, Mr. Ishikawa, who's also from Japan. So there are two connections. And in the third book, I plan on sending Bianca to Japan. I always planned on sending her to Japan in book 3. So book 2 is sort of setting that up, and it's a follow-up. It sort of completes the story from book 2 because this netsuke is a missing piece to a collection. So I won't tell you more than that, but that's why I chose a particular type of artifact. It could have been anything, but my passion is Japanese culture, and so I'm hoping to get back there this fall. We'll see. So thank you, Lane, for that question. What I'd like to do now is get to some general art questions for the authors on the panel. we want to talk about why do we write about art? Why do we find it a rich area to build a story around? For me, art captures the imagination, the history, and the uniqueness of these items. The collectability is really what drives my interest. And in general, greed is a motive for these mysteries and thrillers. But artifacts sort of kind of tweak it a little bit. They have even more value. They're irreplaceable. And that aspect that feeds on that greed is sort of like greed on steroids, right? And centering a story on an artifact seems like a natural thing to do for a mystery or a thriller. So what about you, Mary? Do you have, what's your thinking on this?
Well, growing up a military brat in Germany, I spent a lot of school field trips and tours with my parents, going to a lot of old churches full of, 100-year-old artwork inside them, castles and museums. And so I learned to appreciate art and artifacts at a pretty young age. And I have to admit that, like you said, they just spark my imagination. They seem to be a bit richer than it. It's more than just money. It's the interest in the object.
Absolutely. Connie, why don't you give us your...
Yeah, I mentioned before that this is the world that I grew up in. And one of the things that I would do with my parents would be go to antique shows where different antique dealers would have booths. And the interesting part of that was that they all talked, and there were so many fascinating stories about different dealers and people they bought from and who they sold to and what objects were really worth and who had this object and that. And there was a lot of intrigue always connected with that. And so, and a lot of gossip. So I kind of loved that part of it. But the other part of it is that antiques and artifacts, especially ancient things, they have to do with history, which is one of my passions, the past. And so an object of the past is a little bit like a time traveler. It was made in the past and used in the past, but it has survived into the present. And every object does have a history. And this history in my books has an impact on the present. And that is really true for all of us, I think. We don't just live in the present. We are sitting on the top layer of a very rich, full history. And even if we don't recognize it, what we do, how we think, how we feel is in part determined by the past, either making that part of our life or even reacting against that. And so that really is kind of the interest in my books, the history, the past, and how that impacts the present.
That's fascinating perspective. Thank you. Nina, why don't you add to that? Oh, you're muted, I think.
I think that you're hearing from everybody is there's a passion. So I think art really arouses passion in people. And all of us have been talking before about, as mystery writers, you can almost attribute some of the 7 deadly sins to being instigated by art. We talked about greed, but there is also lust and pride. And for me, the portrait gallery, this gallery of beauties, was something that really did exist and was an example of lust and pride. There was a gallery of beauties that I saw in Munich in the palace of Ludwig I, otherwise known as Mad King Ludwig, where he commissioned the portraits of the most beautiful women of Munich to hang in his palace as a matter of pride, to show how, Munich, Bavaria, the Bavarian kingdom had such beautiful women and they had such nobility of beauty. And then I went to Hampton Court Palace, and a lot of people don't know that, and I didn't know until I was sensitized to the fact that noblemen and kings made these galleries of beauties. There are 2 galleries of beauties in Hampton Court Palace, and one was done by William of Orange, who came and been king after James I. And after his wife died, he had the portraits of all the noblewomen from the court painted in his man cave And it was a place he went for solace. And he thought looking at portraits of beautiful women also was a source of pride for his kingdom. And it soothed some of his sad thoughts. Whereas above him in an upper gallery, there's this huge entry hall that was the Gallery Beauties for Charles II. And that gallery was known as the Windsor Beauties, and they were basically portraits of his mistresses. So more in the realm of like Playboy centerfolds were his portrait gallery. So that was really more for lust. So as you can see, and I realized for me, the portraits were throughout history, as Connie touched on, portraits were a real matter of history. If you think about, I went to art school, if you studied Velázquez, he was the portrait painter. Every court had a portrait painter. He painted the portraits of all the nobility of court. Almost every king had their own designated portrait painter. And that, again, was for their pride. It was, and then nowadays there was one of the popes has a very famous portrait of himself. And it's now, you can see it in the Gallery Doria Pamphili, where you see all these incredible portraits that were amassed by people over the centuries as a matter of pride, and again, either lust or greed. So I think that for a mystery writer, art holds that beauty of it being able to arouse passions that might have been well buried before, but then you can kind of use it as an instigator to create the scenario that will lead to the murder. In my book, The Gallery of Beauties, what happens is the subjects of the portraits begin to be poisoned one by one. And so the courtesan and the rabbi's daughter must go together to try to find out who's poisoning these beautiful women.
Fascinating. Lane, tell us a little bit about why you write about art.
Well, I'm so interested in art crime because art is important to people for different reasons. And a lot of it gets back to the power of objects, and the power of objects is real, and the power they hold over us. But to keep going with what Nina was saying about pride, the American wealthy families today, as well as, in the founding of the country, they were never going to have titles. They were never going to be made dukes or earls or anything like that. So how did they telegraph to the public that they were somebody, that they were cultured? Well, they would buy art, but almost immediately that wasn't enough. They had to become collectors.
Mm-hmm.
That just, when you see how people use art, you see a lot of ways that crime can be an offshoot of that.
Absolutely. Well, that's great. Let's take a minute and talk about our research. What type of art research we did for our books, or, what was an interesting tidbit that we found, maybe something that made it into the book or didn't make it into the book. For me, my research is easy. I travel to Japan regularly. I have an extensive library of Japanese books. With my son living there, I have contacts I can consult, even more knowledgeable than my son, because people that he has contacts with. And of course, there's always the internet. So my research has been pretty straightforward. And as far as a tidbit, a piece of interesting information, when I discovered is that when a Netscape was commissioned, a statuette was commissioned, if it was commissioned for someone significantly higher than the artist station, like for nobility, then he did not necessarily sign it, right? That was like a show of humility. So I thought that was an interesting little tidbit, and it actually did make it into my book. I'm going to go back to Lane. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your research?
Well, I have a postgraduate certification in antiquities, theft, and art crime. But the research never ends, does it? You have to stay up to date. And one of the things I learned that I used in this first book was that because the protagonist is trying to stop a world war on art. Someone is attacking masterpieces around the world. But usually when art is attacked in a museum, it's a painting of a woman and the eyes or the breasts are attacked. A psychologist would have could work on that for years, right? so this was out of character, and so I used that. And then, of course, just a few months ago, the Mona Lisa was attacked again, and it wasn't a very serious one. They threw a pie at it, but again, what is it? So I like I said, I started with my postgraduate certification, and then I just keep researching.
Very good. And Connie, can you give us a little insight into your research?
Yes. The object in the shadow of memory that is kind of central is a 15th century painting by the Dutch master Jan van Eyck. It's called Christ Healing the Demoniac from the Bible story. And whatever Kate has to know, I have to know. So the problem with this painting is that it had it didn't have a very well documented provenance, meaning the history of ownership. It went back only so far, but not back to the 15th century. And so Kate and her colleague Ivor Tweedy have to figure out, is this really by Jan van Eyck? He did not typically sign his paintings on the painting. There's one notable exception for that. But so I had to do a lot of research into, first of all, how was a painting painted in the 15th century? How did the Netherlandish painters do it? And I learned that they were the first. Jan van Eyck is usually credited with the first one. I don't think he really was. He was one of the first to use heat-bodied linseed oil as a binder for the pigments, which was a great improvement, because first of all, you could make a lot more of the pigment at one time, so that your colors were very uniform, and also just having to do with the luminosity of the paint. So I had to learn about that. And then I also, because they were trying to figure out if this was really a genuine painting, I had to learn about how forgeries are made. And how people today, or in like the last century, could actually reproduce a painting that would appear to be a 15th century painting. And there are ways to do that. But the most interesting tidbit that I learned was about the modern technology, spectrography, especially, because it is actually true that, much like police use this, nobody can go into a crime scene and be there for any length of time and not leave something of themselves in that crime scene. No one can actually paint a painting without leaving something of the 21st century in that painting. So it could be a piece of dust. It could be a tiny fiber from a Orlan sweater. And so that to me was absolutely fascinating, and how today people detect art forgeries. And there have been some very famous ones. And I'm just going to mention one. Sotheby's gallery in London bought a Frans Hals painting from a gallery, and they sold it for $10 million to a collector in the United States. And by modern spectrography, it was determined to be a forgery. And they had to, of course, pay the man back, but then they had to, there was a long court case against this gallery. Did they know it was a forgery, or did they not? But there's been a whole series of these forgeries, and many of them were traced back to one single fabulous artist who could mimic the styles of many different old masters. And I just found that fascinating.
That is fascinating. Nina, I think you can add to that. Am I right?
Yeah, so I needed to go to artwork to learn more about what people looked like, what people dressed in the early 1600s. And I go to Venice a lot for my research. And in going to Venice, I always find a new gallery I've never seen. And I found this little foundation that had paintings that were from the 17th century. And in those paintings, lo and behold, there were a lot of paintings of Carnival. And I found in one of the paintings that there used to be a running of the bull across the Rialto Bridge in Venice to open Carnival. And it was whoa. And then there was another scene where it showed bullfights in the Piazza San Marco. So here was something I'd never read about, I'd never found in any of my research, and I've been to Venice a million times, I never heard about. But in this little gallery, I found these paintings that were some artist who was capturing the opening scenes of Carnival, and I was able to find this very, interesting fact out. And then when I did look into it, and in the gallery they had more information about it, I found they discontinued that practice because too many people complained about being gored by the bulls, which is starting to kind of happen in Pamplona these days. But artwork was very, very important to me to get the understanding of what life, what dress was like, what the city was like. Because the other thing about Venice, which I didn't know either, is when you go to Venice now, we all think of it as the city of water, but there are places you can walk around in. Mm-hmm. And if you look at the older maps of Venice, you see that a lot of the places that we're walking around now on were actually canals at one time that were filled in by Napoleon's troops, who were very annoyed that they had to get into a boat to go almost everywhere. So Napoleon had a lot of these areas filled in.
Mm. That's interesting. Very interesting. Mary, give us a little tidbit.
Yeah, that was fascinating. Well, my artifact is a gold statue, a Minoan gold statue. So it's like 3,600 years old. And so I did a lot of research on Minoan gold, and it's just amazing to me, the detail that they could do. They had beautiful, delicate pieces made in gold. Bees, there's a famous bee pendant from Malia that it looks like it could have been made today. It was just stunning. So I looked up, researched, Minoan craft work, the gold work, and also basically Thera, Santorini, and what it was like, the effects of the eruption of that massive volcano. So that was fascinating. And the most interesting thing I discovered when I was there in Santorini on the tour is that at Akrotiri, no human remains have been found in Akrotiri. So there was an earthquake before the volcano, and apparently the volcano gave enough warning for all of the residents there to pack up, get in their boats, take their belongings, apparently all their gold belongings for sure. And they sailed away, hopefully to safety. But that was quite fascinating to me. It was not like in Pompeii where we can see that people were caught. So that kind of made me happy to know that they hopefully got away safely.
Very interesting. That's great. Well, thank you. I think I'd like us to turn to setting now. We have so many wonderful settings in these books. And, everybody says that in certain books, setting is a character in its own right. So why don't we discuss the role that setting plays in our novels? Why did we set our books where we did? Was there any particular, I know we talked about art research, but was there any kind of research for policing or crime solving that was particular to your setting? So maybe Nina, do you want to talk to us a little bit about Venice and what role that plays for you?
Well, obviously Venice is everything in the
Sure.
book. But I have to say that it's not just that it's the backdrop and talking about the canals. The other thing I wanted to capture about Venice, which I hope I've captured in my book, is there's a labyrinthine, sinister undercurrent that's part of Venice. And if you think about all the other novels that are written about Venice, like Don't Look Now, for example, there's that feeling, that atmosphere of kind of darkness and this unknown mystery kind of thing. And that's what I wanted to get to in the plot. So I wanted to make sure the plot felt as twisty as the way you can, walking or getting lost in Venice could be. So I think it really even shaped the format of the novel as well.
That's interesting. And Lane, you have a lot of places in your book. Why don't you give us an idea?
I do. and because it's a thriller, I needed a big playground. And she does travel all around the world to different museums. And that was a lot of fun. But it meant I had to research Interpol, like what they do and what they don't do, in addition to researching security departments in different museums. Louvre, the Met.
Yeah. Mary, why don't you?
Well, my character, Stephanie Adams, is in desperate need of an escape. And I thought Santorini and Crete, Greek islands are just the perfect place to escape. So that's why I set it there. And I think what I'd like to come across and what I hope comes across in my books is that intense heat in the sun and that crystal clear water, but also the ancientness of those Minoan palaces. On Crete, it's Knossos and quite a few others, but Knossos is featured in mine. And Akrotiri with its streets and its buildings and its sewers that were so modern and yet so very, very old.
Yeah, it certainly does come across, and it's a great, I don't know, they're all great armchair travel books. Connie, why don't you tell us a little bit about your setting?
Yeah, well, my setting is the UK. My first book was set in an island in the Scottish Hebrides, and then it has since moved to a very small village in Suffolk, which is an area of England, a county that is not very well known. It's not really on the tourist track, but it is a very ancient part of England. Actually, Norfolk and Suffolk were this part of the Anglo-Saxon culture, the North folk and the South folk. But beyond that, I am a complete and total Anglophile. I had Scottish grandparents. I went to school at St. Clair's College, Oxford, when I was in college. My husband and I traveled there a lot. But there's something about an English village to me. It conjures up the rich history of the mysteries of the Golden Age, for one thing. But beyond that, England, the cliche is that, the English people love eccentrics, and that is really more than a cliche. It is really true. There are just the most wonderful, wonderful characters in England. And my character, Ivor Tweedy, is actually based on a little man who was in charge of a museum that we saw in a village. And in terms of research, traveling there, is absolutely essential. But I am very fortunate to have sources in the UK. So one of my main characters is a detective inspector in the Suffolk Constabulary, and I have a source, a detective inspector in the Suffolk Constabulary. I also have a clergyman in the Church of England. I have someone in the coroner's office in Suffolk. I have a solicitor. So these people, when I have a question, they are very, very generous to answer my question.
That's terrific. You're very lucky. For me, setting is so important in a more general sense. It definitely sets the mood for my books and my series. So like Dead Man's Leap, the book we're talking about this evening, is set in my fictitious village of Batavia-on-Hudson, which is basically in the Catskills or the Hudson Valley where I'm living. And but the next book in my series, Autumn Embers, will be taking place in Japan, in Kyoto. And like I said, this general kind of feeling that, the community-based aspect, right? Whether it's that very intimate village in Batavia or if it's that expat community in Kyoto, it's how these people interact, how they care for each other, maybe how it's idyllic on the surface, but it's not always, what it appears. Also, this book number 2 takes place in the Hudson Valley, and there's cliff diving in the story, and that's something people do here. I don't know why they do it, but they do it. And, it takes place during a major storm and flooding. So it's kind of, it's actually kind of story that needs to happen here. And then, like I said, the next story will be in Japan, and I'm looking forward. I'm working on that book right now, and it's such a rich city in Kyoto. So, to me, it really has a lot to do with setting the mood. I wanted to take I want to see if we can answer quickly, then we'll go on to some questions, a little bit about our main characters and what drove those characters to get involved in these crimes and to investigate, or how they kind of found themselves in that situation. My main character, Bianca, she's an amateur sleuth. Well, we're basically all amateur sleuths, and she finds herself there through circumstance, right? She's not a professional in any way. And so she's always at the right place at the right time, or as the sheriff would say, at the wrong place at the wrong time. And she has good, she has good skills. She's a historian, so she's very observant. She's an outsider, so she has, fresh eyes on things. And so, my character sort of kind of stumbles on being an amateur sleuth, right? In the second book, they're in an evacuation center, so it's tight quarters, so it's easy for her to get back involved. And she's a journalist and a writer, so it kind of puts her in there. And because she has Japanese connections and this artifact is Japanese, she's helpful, right? So Connie, Kate is more, even more knowledgeable, right? So why don't you tell us a little bit about how she gets involved in
Yeah, well, yes. I think that it has to be more than just being nosy, and curious. And Kate is an American antiques dealer. She, like me, grew up in the high-end antiques trade, so she has expertise. In fact, so far she has actually been hired as a consultant by the police twice because of her expertise. But more than that, she gets involved in these things because people she really cares about. She's come to really care about the people in this small village, my fictional village of Long Barston in Suffolk, and she has come to care about them. And in each of the books, one of those secondary characters kind of rises to the top, and something happens, and Kate is wanting to help them, to clear them of guilt, to use the knowledge that she has to play upon that. And her counterpart is Detective Inspector Tom Mallory. So he is a policeman. He is bound by police procedures. He has to deal in evidence. He has to deal in facts. And yet Kate is not bound by any of those things. So she can speculate. She can draw conclusions. She can even think ahead. And fortunately, Tom has come to respect that about Kate.
Yeah, our characters seem to have those things in common. Mary, what about Stephanie?
So Stephanie, she did an internship in Crete long ago before she became a banker, but now in the current day, she's been passed over for a promotion to vice president at the bank that she's been promised for 3 years. So she needs to get away, and she figures going back to Santorini and Crete to see this Akrotiri treasure exhibit is the perfect escape for her. And she has a tenuous connection to the Akrotiri snake goddess. 40 years earlier, her father had discovered a seal stone with the image of that exact goddess and the skyline of Akrotiri on it. Unfortunately, that marble steel stone was stolen, and it is that this wealthy bride on the ferry from Santorini to Crete accuses Stephanie's father of stealing. Well, the bride ends up murdered the day after the Akrotiri snake goddess is stolen, and the police now have 2 high-profile crimes to solve, and both of them lead straight to Stephanie. So she does her best to clear her father's name and keep herself out of jail. And she just doesn't know who to trust because, of course, not everyone is what they seem.
Of course. And Lane, what about Emma?
She is she works at a fine arts insurance company as a fine arts title underwriter. And she's also an adjunct professor at NYU. And the police and the FBI need her expertise, but she is determined to get the answers before the FBI because in case it has something to do with her secret. And so everything she does is based on keeping her very big secret.
Right. And Nina?
Yeah, well, Diana, who's the rabbi's daughter, she is a Talmudic scholar, and one of the things that she is one of the current interests that had been going on at that time was Kabbalistic thinking. And part of that Kabbalistic thinking was that there was a transference of souls. So there could be a temporary transference of one soul into another. And like many primitive people that you read about, like the Maasai who are afraid of getting their picture taken, she had this thought that maybe when her portrait is painted, because she marvels at the way the artist is able to capture so much of the likeness and the spirit of his subjects, that she thinks that maybe when he paints her, there will be that kind of transference of the soul that occurs between her and the artist. So aside from this, intellectual curiosity, she also has kind of this mystical thinking that maybe art will give her this incredible mystical experience that she's read about. And then, of course, when she also her eyes are open to the whole art world and she gets out into Venetian society, it's just like a kid in the candy store, and she's so interested in what's going on. And then she becomes swept up as she finds the first one of the subjects poisoned. And she also has an expertise in medicines and herbals. So she recognizes the poison, the signs of the poisoning. So that also means that she's drawn into it because she understands poisons as well, which helps her become the amateur sleuth to help investigate who might be behind it.
Well, very interesting. So we have a few questions. I'm going to go to those questions and then we'll wrap up and we'll tell everybody what we're doing before, what we're working on now. So I have 3 questions. The first one is addressed to Nina. What was the painting on the cover of your book, and who's the woman, and how is it a part of the story?
Well, the painting on the cover of the book is an authentic portrait of a woman from the 17th century, which is what I wanted to have. However, it is not a Venetian woman, it is an English woman. So it is a portrait of somebody of that time. I wanted to make sure it was authentic, the look and the clothing. When I picked it, I have to say my husband said, "Do not pick that picture, she's ugly." And I explained that our views of beauty are different today than they might have been at that time. But I wanted to capture, there are very few portraits. I have seen some other portraits of some of the characters in the book. One of them is a famous woman poet who lived in the ghetto. Her name was Sarah Copio Sulam. However, that portrait I've only found as an etching, so it only existed in black and white. So it's, very hard to find a portrait of a woman of that time, and that's what I was looking for. But thank you for asking.
Thank you, Nina. Thank you, Teresa. That was a good question. Thanks. And then Ava Jane asked, with the exception of Ms. Waxman, are the books by the other 4 authors taking place in the present time frame? And I see generally that's the case, right, everyone? Yeah.
Yes.
And
Yeah, I would just add that mine do take place in the present time, but there is a big historical element in all of mine as well.
I have somewhat of, I look back a little bit too, and actually mine doesn't take place exactly in modern day, but in modern enough. And someone asked, on average, how long does our research take? I think that's a really hard question to answer. I think it depends for all of us what it is. And plus there's that rabbit hole, right?
6 months.
Yeah, exactly. You could start looking for one simple piece of information and get so engrossed and so interested, right?
Yes.
I don't know. Somebody want to answer anything more specific to how long research takes? I mean,
about 6 months is what I take.
that's what I think that people who do deep research for the types of things you're doing are taking about half the time they need to write the book. They're researching.
Yeah.
Well,
I don't research it like in advance. I don't do all the research and then I write the book. I'm actually researching as I go along because I find something, I go, oh, that's interesting. I need to find out about that. So I am constantly doing research, and it can be very, very time consuming.
I was going to say the same thing, because sometimes I'm in the middle of writing and then all of a sudden I want to write, like I was writing about my character walking down a street and smelling bakery goods. And then I started thinking, well, would she smell bakery goods? Did they have bakeries in those days? Or sometimes you're writing about a character eating dinner and you just have to think, oh, what would they eat for dinner? And all of a sudden you run to Google and you start researching what did people eat at this time period or in this place, or what's the common food or something like that, because you want to get it right. And I've heard a lot of, when you're writing, contemporary mysteries, especially, you want to make sure that if you're saying your character is driving down Route X, there better be a good Route X for your character to drive down.
Yeah.
Jim's asked us a question about why we chose amateur sleuths like a Miss Marple rather than pros like Poirot or Dalglish. I mean, anybody want to take that?
I'll just say,
I have an opinion on it, which is, to me, I always enjoyed reading about smart people, particularly smart women, who can see things with fresh eyes and, come to conclusions without those constraints. I think somebody talked about that, right? You don't have the same protocols. And plus, it's police procedurals. That's a whole talk about research, right? That's a whole nother vein of research, right? Nina, you wanted to say something about this?
Yeah, I said, in a historicals, one of the great things about writing historicals is you don't have to worry about forensics or any of those kind of things.
That's right. That's an advantage.
So everybody's an amateur sleuth. They didn't have anybody who was really a professional sleuth if you write a historical perspective.
Well, there's such a great history. I'm sorry, Mary, do you want to go ahead?
Oh, I was just going to say that Nina's Diana does actually know a lot of, she does a bit of forensics herself with the botany.
Yeah. And I was just going to say there's such a rich history of amateur sleuths in literature. And there's a reason that they're so popular. And that is, you have a village and everything is fine. And then chaos comes to town in form of a murder. And the amateur sleuth symbolizes the power of one well-meaning person to put the chaos or the devil back behind the wall. And so it's something in literature that resonates with me, with most of us. And of course, the police procedural, that's the ability of society to put, or authority to put that devil back behind the wall. And then you've got a third, which is the private detective, which is that gray area.
And I think we are right at 8 o'clock. So I just want to add one more thing, and that is I love police procedurals, but the kinds of books that I write, I can't have policemen talking the way I want to talk in my books. I don't want to have the kind of language that I know is realistic, and I'm fine reading it. I just don't feel comfortable writing it. So, so that was just another little added reason.
I love that. So why don't we wrap up and tell everybody what we're doing? And while we're doing that, if we could answer Rosamond's question, which is what's our favorite authors? I guess if you want to name one or two of your favorite authors while you tell us, what you're wrapping, what you're doing for next. Who wants to start? Nina, you want to give us
I'll
idea
start.
What you're doing next? And
my next book, this is the first in a series called Venice Beauties. So this book is from the perspective mainly, it goes between the rabbi's daughter and the courtesan, and with the rabbi's daughter being first. The next book is called The Courtesan's Secret, and it really focuses on the courtesan Belladonna, her background and how she's threatened. And instead of Diana coming out of the ghetto, the courtesan goes in the ghetto to hide from her enemies. So she's hiding in plain sight. So that's the second of my books. And as far as my favorite authors, I have so many favorite authors that I love, and most of them are writing historicals. Of the modern historicals, I really like James Benn, who writes, World War II. His Billy Boyle series. I love his series. I think that's fantastic. And some of the older series that I like Anne Perry's series, also Victorian series. And now she's writing a new one, a thriller series that takes place also in World War II.
Thank you, Nina. Lane, what are you doing next?
I am working on book 2 in this series. It's called The Canvas, and I'm getting ready for the launch of Dead Men Don't Decorate. And I will just say that, I like a lot of authors, and 4 of them are here today.
Nice. And Mary, why don't you tell us what you're doing?
Oh, thank you, Elaine. I'm working on the next one in the Intrepid Traveler series, in which Stephanie goes to Venice, and it is titled Death on the Grand Canal. And right now, a couple of my favorite authors, besides these four, of course, are Ellen Byron and Alexia Gordon. I like Alexia Gordon's Gethsemane Brown series.
Mhm.
Nice. Those are fun. And Connie, what are you doing next?
Book 4 in the series came out just this past May. A novella will be coming out for the holidays in 2023. That will be book 4.5. And then in 2024, book 5 in the series. And I read almost all, if I'm choosing, British crime fiction. So I love Anthony Horowitz, Ruth Ware, Ellie Griffiths, Charles Todd. I'm forgetting a whole bunch, but Susan Hill. I love Susan Hill. Yeah.
Great, thanks. And for me, I'm also working on the next book in my series. It'll be book 3. It's called, at least now, it's entitled Autumn Embers. I'm also working on some short stories, interconnected Japanese short stories, and a standalone. I'm not really working on that. It's just sitting in the back burner, wishing I was working on it. But I'm also working on a mystery conference, Murderous March. It's next March 10th and 11th. Mark your calendars. Keep your eyes open. I'll send information around soon. Please look into our websites if you're interested. We have lots of information about upcoming events, ways to sign up for our newsletters. Nina was nice enough to put a PDF document somewhere in here, a little bit up there. It's a downloadable document that you can just click on and it'll download, and it has all our information on it. So we'd love to hear from you. We love to stay in touch. So please write to us if you have questions. Thank you for coming tonight. And thank you to Robert.